Good evening, and thank you for joining us. My name is Margot, and I'm the Manager of Public Programs here at the Brooklyn Museum. It is my absolute honor to welcome you to our last Brooklyn Talks of the season. Tonight, we are celebrating our special exhibition, Consuelo Kanaga, Catch the Spirit. This type of programming, when we open the galleries late for intimate viewing and dialogue, is made entirely possible by all of you, our visitors, our incredible members, and our supporters at the council level. Thank you for being here. Tonight, we are looking at the profound legacy of Consuelo Kanaga through two duets, conversations between exhibition curators and contemporary photographers who take some inspiration from her work. Our program begins with a conversation between artist Qiana Mestrich and curator Pauline Vermare. Afterward, we'll hear from Mitchell in conversation with curator Drew Sawyer. The program will then culminate with a group Q&A on stage between all four speakers, and we hope that you'll save your questions until then. I'll take a moment now to introduce each speaker in order of appearance. Qiana Mestrich is a photography-focused interdisciplinary artist, photo historian, writer, and SEO professional who lives and works between Brooklyn and New York's Hudson Valley. Born and raised in New York City to immigrant parents from Panama and Croatia, Mestrich's autobiographical work and research engages issues around Black, mixed-race identity, motherhood and mothering, women's corporate labor, and self-determination through fashion. Her work is currently the subject of a solo exhibition at Baxter Street Camera Club of New York. Pauline Vermare is our Phillip and Edith Leonian curator of photography. She organized the Brooklyn Museum's presentation of Consuelo Kanaga, Catch the Spirit, with Imani Williford, curatorial assistant of photography, fashion, and material culture. For our second duet, Mitchell is an artist, photographer, and filmmaker based in Brooklyn. His work introduces new narratives around beauty and desire, embracing themes of the past and creating fictionalized moments into the imagined future. Mitchell's work is characterized by a visual representation of Black life that emphasizes empowerment, transcendence, play, and self-determination. He is often inspired by pastoral and domestic scenes from his upbringing in suburban Georgia. In 2018, he made history as the first Black photographer to shoot a cover of American Vogue for Beyoncé's appearance in the September issue. The following year, a portrait from that series was acquired by the Smithsonian National Portrait Gallery for its permanent collection. His work is also in the collection of the Brooklyn Museum, among many others. Last but certainly not least, Drew Sawyer is an art historian and a curator who holds the title of the Sondra Gilman Curator of Photography at the Whitney Museum of American Art. He is the curator of Consuelo Kanaga, Catch the Spirit. Without further ado, please give a warm Brooklyn welcome to Qiana Mestrich and Pauline Vermare.
Good evening, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us tonight. I want to start by thanking Drew Sawyer for curating this beautiful show, Consuelo Kanaga, Catch the Spirit, which has been inspiring many people, first and foremost myself, it was the first show that I was presenting here at the Brooklyn Museum. And I'm so excited that we're able to have this conversation tonight with Qiana Mestrich and Mitchell to talk about the legacy of Kanaga's work, because Kanaga is not so well known, and I feel like this is exactly the moment that Drew and I as curators work for, those conversations around the legacy of an artist and what, the resonance of a work decades later, what it means today and what it means to artists today. So thank you, Drew, and thank you, Qiana, and thank you, Tyler, for being here, and thank you all for joining us. So I'm first going to introduce Qiana and her work, and then Qiana is going to present a few of the Kanaga photographs that inspire her or, resonate with her. So Qiana Mestrich is an interdisciplinary artist and photo historian whose work critically engages with themes of Black and mixed-race identity, motherhood, women's labor, and the empowering role of fashion. Informed by her upbringing close to the Brooklyn Museum as the daughter of immigrants from Panama and Croatia, Qiana's artistic practice is complemented by significant contributions to the field of photography history. A graduate of the ICP Bard College MFA, Qiana received her BA with a concentration in photography from Sarah Lawrence College. The importance of her contributions to the field has been recognized in recent years with the 2022 Magnum Foundation's Counter History Grant for her research on women of color in the corporate workplace, and this year through awards like the Saltzman Prize and CPW Vision Award. Qiana has also written essays on photography for exhibition catalogs and art journals. In 2007, she founded the groundbreaking initiative Dodge and Burn, Decolonizing Photography History, which evolved from a blog into a vital critic group actively championed photographers of color, and into a book that just came out featuring interviews from the blog alongside critical essays on photography. She is also the co-editor of a critical book, How We Do Both, Art and Motherhood. And I think that's when we met. You were, I think, working on this when we met at ICP many years ago. Qiana's work is currently on view, as Margot mentioned, at Baxter Street Camera Club, inaugurating their new location at 144 Ludlow Street. The show is called The Reinforcements. The series of photo collages presented in the exhibition visualize the labor history of Black and immigrant women of color in the American corporate workplace. Drawing from archival images, including photographs of her own mother, the work talks to the everyday realities and systemic inequalities that have long defined professional life for women of color in the US. This body of work stems from Qiana's broader ongoing research project towards a history of women of color in the workplace, an independent digital archive aimed at documenting and interpreting the role of women of color in the American labor force from the Civil Rights Acts of 1964 to the early 2000s. In response to the absence of robust archival material addressing these inequities, Qiana has created speculative visual narratives by collaging images from vintage fashion and office supply magazines. Don't miss her beautiful show at the Baxter Street. It will be on view until August 13th. So Qiana and I met at ICP many years ago while researching for the presentation of the Consuelo Kanaga show here. I stumbled upon the writing of Qiana about Kanaga on a blog called Fans in a Flashbulb that I used to love at the time. And I'm going to quote just a few sentences from what Qiana had written at the time about Kanaga, which really I thought was beautiful, and coming from you as well, and knowing you and knowing your work, it really meant so much. So Qiana wrote, there were very few non-black photographers in the early 20th century who were depicting African Americans in a positive light. Kanaga had no prescribed agenda in depicting African Americans. She didn't simply show likeness in her portraits. She conveyed deep human emotions from an American population who at the time were often relegated to subhuman depictions. Both her camaraderie with and influence by the African American community shows Kanaga's understanding of a culture that was in many ways completely opposite to her own. Her work served as a glorious alternative to the negative stereotyping of the time and is now a unique page in American photography history. So now I would love for Qiana to tell us about a few images by Kanaga that have inspired her or moved her more.
Thank you, Pauline, and thank you, Drew, for curating such a beautiful show. Thank you all for coming tonight as well. It's really nice to have you guys here, and definitely would love to keep this an intimate conversation, and would love to be in conversation with you guys as well later on. I learned about Consuelo Kanaga through early education in photography. I went to boarding school for high school upstate New York in Troy, and I took black and white darkroom photography for 3 years there, and got a heavy dose of the early modernist photographers like Kanaga and Imogen Cunningham and Tina Modotti and the Bravos, and really fell in love with that style of photography. And you know, as I was learning black and white darkroom, and was particularly interested in Kanaga's work because of her depictions of black folk. Just felt so personal, and so there was an intimacy with herself and the subject that I felt I had never seen before. And even in her still lives, I feel like there's this intimacy in her lens and in her portraits. There's a physical comfort and a personal pride in a lot of her subjects that really come through in the imagery. And also as an artist, practicing photography, using photography as a form of social commentary was really interesting to me as well. But along with sort of these modernist aesthetics of this really precise composition, and I was taught early on to, as I was telling someone in the audience earlier, composition was really done in camera, and so there was this really purist form of composing that I was trained in. There was, it was almost a negative to crop or to do any sort of post-production work, which actually Kanaga does a lot of in her own work, I think, which is why she was able to capture such a closeness with her subjects as well. There's that beautiful image in the show of the farmer and just how she crops his profile and his body so closely in the image itself. I love other things about her specifically. I really enjoyed the introduction to the show, how it talks about as a woman photographer, it was really hard for her to even make a living as a photographer, and how she also had to work full-time jobs because the field was so dominated by men. This is something I've definitely experienced in my own life as well. Once I graduated college, way back in 1999, it was really hard to break into the field of photography. It was still heavily male. Most of even the photography assistants were male. I also didn't have a driver's license, which was a thing that really was a requirement back then. Being a city kid, I didn't drive, so that was definitely a strike against me. But I really, I would go to these studios. I would go to a lot of the studios back then were in what's now Tribeca. And go to Stephen Meisel's studio, and I was interning at a lab called MV Labs, and also delivering prints to these studios. And yeah, I always felt like I didn't see people who looked like me in these studios, in these roles. So I was really touched to hear that, to read that intro to the show about how she really struggled to, with her identity as a photographer, but just proving her worth, I think, which is really sad, but at the same time, we have such a great body of work of hers as well. And for me, what is so amazing about Kanaga is just her mastery of the art form of photography, the scientific aspects of photography, her precise exposure, her use of shallow depth of field, her the way that she vertically shoots her portraits, and really kind of uses this rule of thirds, and really makes the eyes sort of in this top third of the picture, so that there's this real intenseness that she evokes in her portraits. Her subject angles are always so carefully considered. Whether it's, in this previous image called After Years of Hard Work, which also reminds me so much of the last known portrait of Harriet Tubman, which was in 1911, taken at her home in Auburn, New York. Very similar image where Tubman's sitting in a rocking chair, also with her hands placed on the arms of the chair. And, just this subject angle of Kanaga just straight on, for me, it's just, there's so much respect and there's just so much confrontation almost in this image with that the viewer has to grapple with and deal with. But then, this sort of real Hollywood-esque portrait as well is amazing, which I love. I love this sort of staring up at the sky angle that she gets of Frances. And there's so many versions of Frances as well that we see in the show, which is beautiful. I love the one of her with the white flower. And then, of course, I think Tyler and I are talking about a lot of the same imagery because this is just such an iconic Kanaga picture as well. This is, for me, like the epitome of motherhood, no matter what tone, color, class, race you're in. For me, this is the epitome of what it means to be a mother. You're constantly shielding your children. I have 2 children myself. And you feel like you're just constantly shielding your children from the world. And I just, this again, the use of the tonality in this picture and the children being in shadow, again, sort of conveying the sense of protection is really beautiful. Kanaga's also, her use of low-key lighting is really amazing. How none of her pictures are sort of evenly lit. They're just always so dramatic in her use of shadow and light. Which is, again, gives this feeling of sometimes mystery, sometimes a little tension. It's amazing how, as a photographer, she really used the medium as an art form and really to express emotion and to almost entertain the viewer in a way. And then, I love this particular image I chose and wrote about actually in a separate blog post for the Fans in the Flashbulb blog. I wrote both of those blog posts during my graduate studies. ICP used to have an MFA program with Bard College in the city, and I was, in my second year, I believe, I was interning with the ICP collections, and again, was just excited to see some of their images of Kanagas in the collection and wrote about this particular flower, and I'd love to read what I wrote for you guys. It says, this simple flower, still life, is of the camellia, which was designated as Alabama state flower in 1959. Consuelo Kanaga shows the white bloom having been cut with a single leaf and placed in a glass of water, as if to decorate a tablescape. Considering her portraits of Alabama resident Anime Merriweather, which I'll show in a second as well, Kanaga may have spent considerable time in the state and or within the southern United States where this originally Asian flower is cultivated. Not a typical still life, Kanaga approaches the flower in a similar way as she does her portraits, providing a close-up, showing the flower's form with fairly even lighting, showing its loose petals unfurling and the thick glossy leaf with deep veins. It's almost as if Kanaga wants the viewer to know the flower intimately. So again, really love how she approaches florals and still lifes of florals almost in the same way that she approaches her human subjects, which I find really interesting. But of course, I think also being influenced by some of her contemporaries like Cunningham, who also used to, take a lot of pictures of flowers, and what Edward Weston, and it's amazing. Oh, going back, sorry. Another thing which I loved in the show, I loved reading the text of the show, by the way, Drew, and just in general, but because I was so obsessed with all of these photographers as a child, and as I was learning photography, and I really loved what Kanaga said about Cunningham in one of the wall texts that I'll read. It says, in a letter to Curator Grace M. Mayer at the Museum of Modern Art in New York, Kanaga said of Cunningham, quote, "She is the greatest woman I have ever known in photography, generous, human, and brave." And the reason why I loved that quote, actually, was because I remember years ago talking to someone who knew Cunningham in her later years, and they had said, oh, she was a real diva, she was a real bitch. And I was like, really? Like, because she probably had to be. Like, Cunningham did a lot of Hollywood work as well, Hollywood portraiture work. So reading that quote was amazing to hear, another side of someone who knew her intimately, but who really had a completely different perspective on her. So it was really a joy to read that quote and to get the different perspective. And I don't have the portrait of Annie Mae Merriweather in here, which I think, do I? Oh, missed it.
If you go back.
Yeah. Did I go?
One more.
Mother and son. There we go. Yes, it was the first one. I just really wanted to talk a little bit about this image. One, because just the sadness in her eyes, of course, is what strikes me, and I think probably strikes every person who sees this image, of course. But Kanaga created this portrait of Annie Mae for New Masses magazine, a Marxist periodical published in the US from 1926 to 48. The picture was commissioned to accompany an account of Meriwether's escape from the lynch mob that had murdered her husband as retribution for his involvement with an Alabama sharecroppers union. And there are several portraits of Annie Mae.
Did you go one up? One up is the one you were talking about. Yeah.
Yes, that is the one specifically that I wrote in the Flants in a Flashbook post, and I feel like this is almost like a post-crying moment as well, or just she probably spent many days grieving, but there's just so much energy in this image. It's almost, I feel like, maybe the shutter sort of captured a little bit of movement here. There's almost a little bit of a blurry quality to the image, but yeah, it's just, again, this really close cropping of the image of the face is really intense, and it really forces you to, and I'm assuming as you're reading this article about her account of escaping a lynch mob, you're really forced to deal and reckon with her first-person account and her experience. And so, yeah, Kanaga just, again, amazing in her use of photography. And I did have, I thought, Young Girl in Profile as well, which I think Tyler's going to talk about later, but I really just, I don't think it's in the series. But yeah, Young Girl in Profile, of course, just reminds me of Carrie Mae Weems and her whole Colored People series, again, where she sort of employs this profile of adolescence, and the close-up, and the Young Girl profile is of the young girl, and she's got a white headband on, and it's really kind of one of the really contrasty image, but again, the profile for me is really what is so striking, because it sort of implies this subject really thinking, and I really loved Carrie Mae Weems, when I was kind of researching a little bit about her Colored People series, what she wrote on her website actually about her series and how it features this sort of introspective adolescent boys and girls at an age where she says, quote, when issues of race really begin to affect you at the point of an innocence beginning to be disrupted. And so, yeah, there's, you as a viewer kind of look at these images of these young adolescents in profile, and you also wonder what they're wondering and wonder what their lives are, which I think, for me, portraiture is really effective in that way of kind of, you're seeing just a surface image of a subject, but really successful portraiture, I feel like, wants you to know more, wants you to really dive deeper into who these people might be. And that's really all I had. I don't know if you wanted to.
I just want to add to the Young Girl in Profile, and we'll see it in a moment when Tyler talks about it, but Drew, in his curation of the show, included a few photographs of that same young girl, and in the show they are across on the wall, and it's, I think, 5 of them. And same thing that she did, which is so interesting in post-production, if we can say that, but in the darkroom, cropping the face closer and working with 2 versions of the portrait, another portrait, where she's clearly asked the girl to look, this way, that way, just to get, and all of them are incredibly beautiful and intense, and it's extraordinary that, sometimes you do a portrait, I'm not a photographer, but when you look at the contact sheets of a photographer, you can see when the photographer has worked to get these shots, right? Yeah. But this is a series of incredibly powerful portraits of this one young girl, and so that's a testament also, I think, to what you're saying, the energy that Kanaga put into doing, sorry, establishing the right kind of representation.
Yes.
She really was very, very thoughtful in her way of representing.
Yeah, and it's really quite fascinating because, I think we all know that color photography has a history of being biased against darker skin tones. But Kanaga was really able to represent darker skin tones, I feel like, in this black and white way by her, I could just envision her in the dark room, dodging and burning and using, variable contrast papers and just, filtering and just employing all these various darkroom techniques to get an accurate representation of skin tone, which I think is really admirable as an artist and as a photographer, to do that, especially during this time period, to really push the materials and push the chemicals as much as she could to honor her subjects, and to authentically represent her subjects. So I think that's really important to note.
Thank you so much, Qiana. And I think now we're going to leave the stage for Tyler, Mitchell, and Drew Sawyer to be in conversation, and then we'll join you after.
Yeah.
Thank you, Qiana.
Thank you, everyone.
Well, thank you both for that, for those thoughts on Kanaga, and yeah, thank you, Pauline, especially for overseeing the exhibition here. I think I started working on the show when I joined the Brooklyn Museum in 2018, thinking about how the last survey of Kanaga's work, by that point, was in 1992, and the Brooklyn Museum was gifted her negatives and a large portion of the existing vintage prints shortly after she passed away in the early 1980s, and just thinking about, just a good moment to kind of reassess that work. And I think even, Pauline and I have talked about even so many experts in the field of photography, photo history, are not even so aware of the work. So, but anyways, thank you, Pauline, for really overseeing it here. It was one of the last projects I did before I left the museum in 2023, and that was a traveling show. So it was actually first in Spain at MAPFRE Foundation in Madrid and Barcelona, and then SF MoMA, and then came here. So really, I think, Pauline and the team here really took it on their own, and there's many, many wall texts, including that beautiful introduction gallery, which is not how it was when I organized it in Spain originally. So I'm really thankful for that. It was funny. I was saying that, Tyler and I met shortly after I joined the Brooklyn Museum. I had organized a show on the work of Liz Johnson Archer, and I think you maybe reached out to me over Instagram or you emailed me. I don't exactly remember, but we met for coffee in the neighborhood just around the corner. And I remember at that time telling you that I was working on a show about Consuelo Kanaga, and you knew the work. And I feel like so many people at that point were not, when I would say that, they had no idea who she was. So that really stood out in my mind. So I'm just curious if you could talk a little bit about how you first came to know about the work.
Yeah, well, thank you, Drew. Thank you, Qiana. Thank you, Pauline, Brooklyn Museum, everyone here. It is a lovely coincidence that we kind of met through that project, and then when Consuelo came up, and I mean, for me, it was through a hunger of looking for these kinds of representations, really. It was from, the tutelage of, my professor, Deborah Willis, and, even her great, and I always have to shout her out because really it does start there for me in terms of learning the breadth and history of black subjects in front and behind the camera. And Consuelo, of course, being a white woman from San Francisco or Oregon, and then San Francisco, but making these images which I found profoundly empathetic, poetic, rejecting a sort of anthropological lens of black Southern life, and being a Southerner myself, were just incredible roadmaps for how to map my practice and think about making my own pictures. That's kind of what it was. Exactly. When you brought up her name, I was just like, oh yeah, I love the work, and didn't know you were, I don't remember if you mentioned or not that you were planning the show. You might have.
I might have just talked about how the museum has a lot of her work, but I think it's true. I think a lot of people probably know the work through Deb Willis's writings and work and books, which often have featured the work of Kanaga. And Qiana, I have to say, I feel like I definitely came across those blog posts, but maybe did not know you were the one that wrote them. Again, because you do a Google search and there's not a lot of information out there, so I'm sure I definitely came across those, so that's a very small world. I thought we could start, you can kind of maybe talk about some of the works, but I thought, when preparing for this talk, I'd visited your recent show at Gagosian with you and walked through it, and then was reading in preparation for tonight an interview you had done, I think with the Brooklyn Rail, and you said, when kind of speaking about the exhibition, kind of this idea, the ghost image is the title, and the person that was interviewing you, I forgot.
Rhea Combs.
Rhea Combs,
Yeah.
okay. And you kind of responded and said, it started with a question: can my subjects not only confront the viewer and be seen, but also be felt, inhabiting space as a spiritual presence? Can photography capture what is unseen but deeply felt? And this kind of made me think about Kanaga's work so specifically, and especially, the subtitle of the exhibition is called Catch the Spirit, which is a quote by Kanaga, of course. And so, I'm curious for you to maybe just talk, we can talk about your work too, but maybe initially just your thoughts about how Kanaga achieves this. Does she achieve it? Or what are the strategies you see when you look at Kanaga's work that are successful in her idea of catching the spirit, of kind of getting these inner feelings of the subject rather than a pure document, or trying to capture what they actually look like?
Yeah, I think for me it's, there's clearly for her a fixation on this idea of transcendence in some way. And again, I think Qiana touched on the idea of the cropping into the faces so deeply. That creates this kind of curiosity for me, or there's clearly an empathetic curiosity that's underlying the entire practice through all her pictures, whether they were photojournalistic, whether they were, abstract, still life, or portrait. The idea of getting closer and having that deep curiosity and empathy is very clear with her work. There's a great also quote she said that was, I would give up resemblance any day to, in fact, depict the inner feelings of a person. This idea of, that's a very modern idea, I would say. The idea that someone in the 20s and 30s, or working in the 20s and 30s, would think about going beyond, the anthropological or documentary purposes of photography to see the inner worlds of these people she's photographing. Again, people who have a different experience than her, right? As a white woman, looking empathetically at often black Southern working class subjects. There can be something strangely paternalistic in that, or something sort of overly romantic in that, and something almost eyebrow-raising about the idea that this woman would sort of travel to these areas. And again, being from the South, I'm often very hungry for these types of transcendent, quite frankly, sublime representations of black subjects. And so in my looking at her work, I'm seeing someone who I do think employed everything she could in photography. And actually, I would sort of, also kind of respond a bit to this idea of exposure. I also, I think there's this idea of accuracy, but I also think she employs a certain kind of imprecise exposure. There's something about the drama in the chiaroscuro that she's using, the darkness of the skin tones, that there seems to be a particularity of rendering, specifically the low end of the register in her black and white photographs that provides potentially even a deeper or more profound poetry to the work. I don't know.
I think of, Qiana mentioned Frances, and there's many images of Frances in the show, which were taken within a few years of each other, but she looks so different in every single one, right? So this idea of exposure, or it is a portrait per se, but of course, you don't really know what she looks like, because in each image she looks totally different. So there is a way in which it feels like through these methods, both in the darkroom but in the camera, that she's able to kind of convey this kind of inner sense of the subject without giving a true sense of what they look like, which maybe protects them in some way.
Yeah, and stripping them of the context, and again allowing the face to be the kind of landscape, so to speak, that the viewer is getting, allows for a lot of an open reading of the work. I think that's profoundly contemporary as well, even despite it being, nearly 100 years ago. Something about that she clearly knew, was aware of, or that's what I'm sensing, that she knew that by removing context and stripping you of that there are more open readings of who this person is, what their life may have been, how we can find empathy in viewing subjects in photography, and particularly in a time where racial terror was law. So right, she's sort of really thinking through that clearly with the camera, I think.
Yeah, I was gonna also, if you go back, I guess to the first image, which Qiana also had, I was also gonna, ask you about this relationship between photography and other art forms, and I was thinking about this image in particular, because it's probably not just because it's Kanaga's most famous. It was included, Edward Steichen, who was the head of photography, the Museum of Modern Art in the 1950s, included it in the Family of Man. Grace Meyer, who was working for him, gave it its title, She is a Tree of Life, to them. That show, that book, are widely read, still reprinted today. But it's also based on a sculpture by Sargent Johnson, who was a San Francisco-based artist who mostly made kind of relief-like sculptures of black subjects. During this time period, many of his works are, at SF MoMA, if you visit there, they're often on view. We actually have one in the collection which might be on, or the Brooklyn Museum has one in the collection which might be on view. But it's directly, like almost a visual quotation of a specific sculpture of a mother with two children at her side. And Kanaga even references it. So it also made me think about, thinking about your own work in relationship to, just thinking about beyond just photographic references. And we'll get later some of your kind of, the way you think about legacy and photography, but I was also just thinking about beyond photography.
Yeah, where do I start? Yeah, there's something that we haven't touched on, which is the deeply sculptural element of this photograph. It almost is in itself a sculpture, emerging from the background of the picture. I also want to point out this interesting fact that this picture was included in Steichen's famous, exhibition at the MoMA in 1955, I think it was. And under it, there was a quote about, this mother drawing her children towards herself, and I think it was something about how she had been the woman, the mother, the figure, has been doing this for thousands of years to protect from I believe it was hurt and discrimination. Something I might be butchering the quote or the caption that was underneath the picture, but the idea of sculptural affect is interesting in my work in a way, or I guess you're asking also a question about lineage, but also sculptural.
I guess I was more, I'm curious less about lineage. We'll get to that, I know, we have some slides. But more so just thinking about Kanaga's work, but also your own, and thinking about not just photo histories or thinking about the relationship to photography, but other media, right? And thinking about this work in particular, which is such a clear quotation of a sculptural work. And you were mentioning the kind of chiaroscuro, the use of shadow that gives all of her photographs such like a sculptural quality, I think.
Yeah, I think for me it's like, I look at a lot of my work as being an extension of myself, which is being a sieve for many mediums, like being a cultural sieve for many mediums, whether that be the photography history or sculpture, film in particular, which informs me deeply. For me, it's sort of one and the same, and it gets filtered through the work that I make. So, but I think Kanaga's also doing that. I really do see that in the work. I see also a deep rejection of sort of the tradition of street photography or of capturing subjects that she has no relationship to. You can feel that this is, and I do think she had a deep relationship with this family, and this was one of the sort of final moments in capturing them at the end of a day when the light was just right, particularly in this moment. But I can sense with her work there being many layers to how she relates to these people, and the strategy she's employing, not only with her camera, but also with her amazing prints in the darkroom in the exhibition, being extensions of many forms of art that, also extend beyond or transcend, again, factual or biographical or documentary, sort of indexical ways of looking at people.
I was going to say, one of the things we were talking about backstage was this tension between the kind of documentary aspect of her work, and there is a strong aspect. And if you see the show after this, there's a section on the worker photography movement, which was so like central was the documentary tradition, especially in the late 1920s, 1930s, both in Germany, where kind of the worker photography movement came out of, and then the US in the 1930s, and Kanaga was very involved in specific groups, publications like New Masses, Labor Defender. She was very tied in a way to the labor movement and its focus on kind of documentary mode, but she was not like most photographers you think of from that period, right? She wasn't taking a 35 millimeter camera out into the street, recording protests or recording strangers. If she met somebody on the street, she was then going up close and taking a portrait with a medium or large format camera, which gives it such a different feel. Obviously that was partially because of her own discomfort with the idea of photographing a stranger from afar. And we were talking about, that you generally don't work in the documentary mode either. You mostly have worked in kind of a staged format or portraiture in the same kind of ways that Kanaga works. I'm curious your feeling about why you work in that way, or like why Kanaga, or the relationship between your work specifically and Kanaga's in that regard.
Yeah, and the idea of collaboration with subjects, which I think she understands, or you can sense she understands with these people. I think of course she was emerged out of that sort of worker photography movement, but I also kind of think she doesn't act or work like any of the rest of the guys who were in that movement, so to speak. And so that's where I find intrigue in the work. For me, I collaborate often with either peers, sometimes other artists, other photographers, sometimes models, and sometimes a commissioned or in a fashion context. And often I'm looking for moments that represent an interiority. And I think there's a way of looking at Kanaga's work similarly, even though it was, again, from nearly 100 years ago, that you could even look at it in the framework of, someone like Kevin Quashie's book, The Sovereignty of Quiet, right? Which is an entire, theory that he puts forward about understanding Black life beyond resistance, right? Understanding that resistance might be the main and dominant and maybe most important framework through which we've come to understand Blackness, right? Or Black American life. And that it is not to take away no power from the importance of resistance and protest, but that there is a rich inner life that can also be sensed in our existence that relates to joy, relates to quiet, relates to sovereignty, relates to transcendence, that I'm also trying to get at in my work. Yeah. And so I think Kanaga understood that deeply 100 years ago, and I find that very contemporary. I will maybe go through my work. Right?
If you want, if you go back to this image, it was like, it's interesting to think about what you said before about the way her images stand out of a context, right? Because they're not documentary. The subjects are generally not situated within the environment in which they are situated, whether that's a domestic one or a landscape or an urban one, a one that maybe signifies their economic position, their class position, right? They're kind of removed from that, so they can just exist in this kind of space. But I was talking about this one, which is another one of her more iconic images from the early 1930s, and I was saying how, it can read as so sentimental, right? It's this image of, or idealistic, right? It's like this image of presumably a white woman's hand, maybe Kanaga's, and presumably a Black man's hand. It's given the hands this scale. It seems like one is a woman's and one is a man's. And I was saying how she actually made this photograph around the same time that she and her sister were arrested with their friend, who's in many of the photographs, some of the ones that we've been seeing, that they basically found on a beach and like kind of adopted him. He was from the South and came to San Francisco to find work. And anyways, they were driving together and got arrested for two white women driving with a black man, and they kind of fought it. And it was huge. If you go to the newspapers from 1931, it's like for weeks and weeks and weeks and months, it's the front page of the newspapers. And they, Kanaga really took the police department to task for what had happened. So the fact that she made this image right at that time, right, has a very deep political meaning, even though it can read as so, again, kind of sentimental, kind of romantic, problematic, maybe in yes, in many ways.
And yet I still think it somehow avoids those trappings, somehow, in the way she staged it. Although I do also feel that when I look at this image, formally it's still a strong image that in a way avoids some of those trappings of you know, the white hand approaching sort of the black hand, and the unity that is suggested in that sort of an image. She's so formally strong that I do believe it, and I do sort of understand what she was sort of trying to be doing in the work.
But yeah, we can now let's look at some of your work. Sorry.
Sure. No. And again, mining photo history or thinking through photo history, specifically in this moment in response to Gordon Parks' June bug. I did want to touch also on, in Kanaga's work, I think there's a deep understanding of photographing younger people, children, as a portal or a sort of pathway, as Qiana was touching on, to a little bit sadly, but also truthfully soliciting empathy when we're talking about representations of Black life. And so, while I don't see myself as working in that mode for that reason, I think she understood that at that time, and I find that to be an interesting aspect of her practice. Parks, similarly, you know, with the story that this photograph particularly references, it was published in Life magazine in, you would know the year better than me, 1963.
It was 1963, yeah.
Which was the story, or the title of the story was What It Feels Like to Be Black, and it was largely photographs of, you know, young black men, adolescent age, teenage age, sort of roaming freely in the sort of Fort Scott, Kansas landscape, very green, brown, murky watered landscape where they're enjoying moments of like sheer simple delights, right? And then it goes along with the literary story that Parks wrote. But these moments of quietude also suggest or imply transcendence, which I find very beautiful. So, yeah.
And it is interesting. I mean, it's looking at the last one and thinking about how much it looks like Kanaga's. And it may, I mean, I wonder to what degree Gordon Parks knew of Kanaga's work. I have no idea.
I do too. Yeah, I don't know. But all of these things I do see as interconnected in the way that I like to bring them together when I'm making my own work. That these are histories that are important to bring forth, to call forth into the conversation today, that are no less important. That's why this show is on view at the Brooklyn Museum, you know, because of the recurring significance of situating these beautiful portraits within a poetic in-between space that suggest a sort of liberation from a lot of the trappings of society then, and, you know, what has and hasn't changed today, so.
Yeah, I'm curious if you could talk a little bit more about this tension between beauty and the kind of politics of representation that's so present, I think, in Kanaga's work, but also yours, and that's both the kind of resistance or a certain set of politics of representation, but then also embedded within that resistance to a certain set, right? There's also a politics to, even when you're trying to resist a certain form of representation.
Yeah. Can't really win. I mean, it's a question, and I think the mode that I've really taken on, and I think it comes from personally my interest in fashion and adornment, which Qiana also touched on. These are beyond frivolous or sort of purely commercial efforts. These are sites of culture where, really conversations are had deeply about what we as a society consider beautiful and desirable, right? And so when you think about, you know, Black existence through those lenses, there's a lot of possibility to engage the political, but also engage the beautiful, and that both are held in equal measure. So for me, those two things have been inextricable, likely because of my own aesthetic proclivities, but also because I understand the sites and the arenas where those conversations are really happening in our culture, and have always been drawn to images that exist, sometimes in an art context, but also sometimes in a broader pop cultural context, or that blur the lines between the two, and that really change how we think about what is beautiful. That possibility that photography has is really intriguing to me.
I mean, I'm curious, how you feel like even in your own career, but also maybe reflecting on Kanaga's time, that has shifted, both within like what's possible within, say, editorial magazine work, but also then, say, on social media, right? There's obviously so many other platforms in which photography can circulate. And that has changed even since you started in a certain way.
Yeah, and it changes daily. I love that there's so many frameworks through which we can understand ideas of personhood now. Like, I think there are, like, visually, like, the literacy is there, photography is there with us from day zero, right? And in ways that they just weren't for people in 1930. I mean, it's more a studio physics question, Drew, because I feel that, like, in a way, it's ever evolving for me, and I'm approaching and exploring these modes of representation that I find enticing to me, to kind of make my own contribution, I guess, to that question. But I think, you could probably map it within a wider contemporary photo history.
I was just thinking, I forgot what images you brought in, but I was even thinking about more recent strategies where you're using fabric to kind of veil subjects, or you're using reflections and mirrors to kind of confuse the viewer when they're looking at something, because the viewer's reflections included, and there's kind of this like even doubling or haze to the image. So just even thinking about the ways you're more recently kind of like troubling the kind of transparency of the image as consumable, and thinking about back to what we were talking about Kanaga, the way that she printed often also, and I was even thinking the few documentary photographs she made of people on the street, she would do burning and dodging to cover their face, right? Because she was really uncomfortable making an image of, a stranger on a street who is in dire straits and living on the street. And so instead she would like burn out the face.
Yeah, that kind of goes to what I was talking about, that imprecise exposure that I find beautiful about her work. The drama and inherent tension and like embracing those deeper tones that I think a photography teacher would tell you to avoid, right? You want bright, proper exposures that should look accurate. You should have high tones. You should have a white point. You should have a black point. I think often her photos don't have a full white point. They usually sit somewhere in the gray and then fall deeply into these rich shadows, which I really am drawn to. And in the more recent work, which I don't know if there's a lot of in this particular presentation, there is a lot of that sort of troubling of the legibility of the photograph, again, to sort of suggest, again, that sort of sovereignty of quiet, or that sort of veil, or also sort of have a material conversation with photography, and again, that border of photography and sculpture. The two mediums are so inextricably linked in my head, and many great sculptors engage photography and vice versa, that for me, again, I don't think it's in this presentation, which now, because we're on the subject, I wish it were. For me, the more recent modes in which I'm working, I think do draw out those qualities that Kanaga understood deeply. The idea of finding, an idea, like a photograph that can situate itself more as a memory, or more as a space in between a spirit or an inner feeling, rather than a strict and straightforward representation.
I know you also brought some images of your show that's traveling right now, and really thinking about kind of legacy, right? The kind of tradition that you're within, and surely Kanaga is one of those photographers not included in this section.
Sadly.
But she certainly could have been. And I was also, saying that, when we met that first time, now more than 5 years ago, what part of your practice was this Instagram account where you would post a lot of images of the things that inspired you, which is so generous, I think, for an artist. Oftentimes, right, artists like to keep their references close or not completely known. But you were really sharing those with your audiences and educating them in a way. and Kanaga was somebody that you posted frequently. So I really loved the idea that you included a section in your show that is all the artists that have kind of inspired you. But I'm also, I also think what is interesting is that those photographers, or artists broadly, not just photographers, all, as we've been talking about, were interested in depicting Black life, but not all of them were Black. So I'm curious, one, just to talk about, again, like how do you see Kanaga or other artists within that tradition? But also just, your choice to kind of include this section in your show.
Yeah, well, yeah, exactly. What we're seeing is, kind of a show within a show that I curated within my own exhibition in Berlin. And in that show, I wanted to, potentially, some part of me wanted to elaborate maybe for a German audience that maybe didn't know my work, but also there was a potential for enlightenment of the lineage from which my work sort of emerges, right? And also just to highlight voices that I find compelling. So it's a bit of both, and it's sort of multi-layered in that way, but that's what we're seeing, and as you're kind of looking at their like material representations, their photographic, representations, their sculptural and painterly evocations, but they all, as you said, emerge out of a context of depictions and grappling with aspects of Blackness or Black life, even if it were not a Black
life,
maker or Southern life. And particularly, there's not a view here, unfortunately, but on the reverse wall of this structure, there's images by Baldwin Lee, right? Chinese-American documentary photographer who's sort of now emerging in the context in like discourse, but made these amazing, powerful, documentary photographs in Mississippi that are just evocative beyond their time, and that I included here because I felt they not only inspire me, but stand up on their own. So I think this idea of like the author behind the camera, I don't know why, but I'm thinking now of a Toni Morrison quote, where Charlie Rose asked her that insidious question of like, when are you going to write a book about white characters? And, then she's like, that's insane. And however, and he was like, well, would you ever? And she was like, of course I could. Anyone can do anything. A white writer could write about Black life. I could write about white life. It's what are we doing here with it? And my project is to center a Black interior life, a fully realized Black world, and to have that not be at the margins of any conversation, right, within the literary space. So I see it as that. I see also this kind of curation as these varying understandings or evocations of Black life that I find compelling beyond their maker in a way. Yeah.
Right, and it goes back to, I think, what you said before, too, about the way Kanaga's work, and especially the subjects in Kanaga's work, are out of context, right? So they can live as aesthetic objects that we don't need to know who made them, right? I think it goes back to that idea of beauty in a certain way. That allows them to exist regardless of who we know the maker is or what the context exactly was. Not that doesn't add complexity and all those things, but I think it does allow it to live in a different space.
Yeah, and as an artist, that's what we're often looking for, is these moments in history where there was someone picking up on the things that you feel are within you. You're like, oh, I identify with that. That is like, and that goes beyond necessarily those aspects, I would say. But we can also talk about
this was this was, and Qiana already mentioned Carrie Mae Weems as well, and this is you included also in your show in this section the chapel. Is that what it was called? You called?
Yeah.
Which feels like she wasn't necessarily directly referencing Kanaga, certainly like 19th century kind of Victorian photography, portraiture. But it's hard not to look at these, especially in the context of tonight's talk, and not think of Kanaga's photographs. Yeah,
absolutely. And this genre of leisure photography, right? The idea of the kind of emergence in French, painting, really, of the flaneur and the sort of these depictions of modern life, where it was like to be a modern person means the ability to have fun, to have leisure, right? That was an idea. Someone made that up, that it was like, when you have time in your day, that means you really made it, right? So it's like, then like, this is in response to that, and I think Carrie obviously picked up on that and drew that out and re-centered these young black girls in the middle of that genre, and it's powerful for that alone, but also formally connected to Kanaga and formally strong, the way the girls are laying, the composition, the amazing sort of costuming or styling or what have you, and the staging, the theatricality, and the powerful gaze of the girls. That somehow registers as timeless to me. Yeah.
I know. I think we're at time. I was given the flag, so. But yeah, we'll all come back up.
No, Tyler, I'm just so blown away. I don't think I've ever seen you talk in person, but I've also, of course, seen your imagery and just so blown away by everything that you said. I think we haven't talked about the hands enough.
The hands.
Yeah. You guys talk about the sculptural elements of some of her photographs, but the hands are so important for me because, she's photographing this time where there's a lot of photography about the worker and, all this, social documentary issues, and her use of the hands is not about work. It's about framing the face sometimes, and it's about, there's the sculptural quality to it, and there's just very tender uses of the hands and spiritual uses of the hands. So.
Yeah. I think it makes me think so much of Stieglitz, who was somebody that when she started working first as a photojournalist, first as a journalist, really, and then she was out in the job as a journalist and started directing the photographers to make pictures, and her editor was like, oh, you're really good at that. You should learn photography. And so she was self-taught as a photographer, and then started looking at camera work, which was Stieglitz's publication. And I think of his use of hands in portraiture especially, and so that's what I kind of make that kind of modernist idea. And you think of his portraits of Georgia O'Keeffe and so many other artists, where the hands were so tied with an idea of, especially kind of an artistic labor. And maybe that's kind of what you were saying. It's like not the hard labor,
right.
Not like somebody who's a worker in that way, but also somebody who's like an aesthete or somebody who's a thinker, and the way the hand is, on their chin, or these other ways that the hand is used in that context.
Yeah, to go off of that, both of those comments, I think my brain jumps around to several moments in recent discourse around hands, photography of hands, specifically in Grace Wells Bonner's exhibition, Spirit Movers, again, thinking about the spirit. There's a beautiful photograph that's not in the show, but that is in the catalog, by Roy de Carava. I think is it Coltrane's hands? It's hands that are dancing through this dark space, maybe in a concert, and the show has a lot to do with, also capturing a spirit, but also sort of musicality, and how the hands are expressive. So even in that sort of tight crop of those hands that de Carava did, the expressivity stands in for some aspect of Black life that is powerful and is beautiful, honestly, in and of itself. Also, sorry, because now I really am jumping around here. The amazing hands in, there's de Carava, and then, of course, it flies out of my head the moment I'm about to say it. But I was going to connect it to this kind of recent and still working through how I feel about it, but this Bottega Veneta campaign that I'm seeing all over the streets, like this very month, which was all about craft and this idea of centering the hands. So this is a tradition, I would say, or this is a language, right, that got maybe started with Kanaga. One could argue started with Kanaga.
There's a beautiful photo by Alma Levinson of her, actually, of Kanaga, and you see her hands. It's in the intro of the show, and the hands that she had were magnificent. She had incredible hands. And it struck me after a month of giving tours and of looking at the hands in the photographs of other people, including perhaps her, the photo you were talking about. She had spectacular hands, and not in the sense of, they were beautiful, but you could see that there was something important about, and hands tell us a lot about people, I would say. You can learn a lot. And I feel like, yes, aesthetically she found a beauty and a value in hands, but I think there was something more to this. And I think the whole connection, collaboration, I think this was also almost symbolically key.
I just thought of it, sorry.
Picture?
What I was also going to bring up, which is of course one of the greatest, hand photographers in all of history, is David Goldblatt. The particulars and this idea of creating a portrait of a nation through detail, through mostly hands and feet, sometimes awkward angles of thighs, knees. There's a beautiful picture of again, this is white South African photographer, very socially concerned, who set out to sort of make this portrait of, divided apart, post-apartheid South Africa, by way of details, very intimate details of black and white people throughout South Africa. But there's a black hand sort of just softly resting on this blanket, and that's kind of all you get. You get the light, and you get the dimensions and the volumes and the beauty of these forms coming together, and suddenly you're also kind of devastated knowing the context of it being within apartheid South Africa. So another socially concerned photographer, again, moving transtemporally later than Kanaga, someone who could see how photographs of details of hands and feet go way far beyond just details, right?
Right, and the Ernest Cole photograph that I think had a strong impact on Hank Willis Thomas is also hands lifted. So yeah, absolutely, huge importance, yeah. Should we open to questions from the audience?
I have a question.
Where? Hi.
So, hi, thank you so much for sharing your your psyche with us. It's very meaningful now more than ever, and there's something that will never be televised in transmission. And thank you so much for opening up your internal processes. And my original question was for Qiana, because I looked up your bio, and there's this powerful title, and it's in my bookmark list, but the title, I think, it just clicked something in my own psyche of value and passing down experiential wisdom, which I think is a lost rites of passage. And the book is how we do both art and motherhood, and it's just so powerful. I can't wait to read it, because the psyche is something that is our greatest tool, and it's so misunderstood as a Black American because of the amount of external subconscious bias we have to constantly navigate. Even today, even in this room, there's some subconscious bias that we'll never be able to discuss because it's too triggering. But I wanted to ask, given the lessons that you've learned as an artist and a mother in lifetime, do you have anything that you learned that you simply learned through your own experiential wisdom that no one could ever tell you, but you just had to synthesize yourself as being a mother and an artist?
Just to keep going. If you get caught up in the day-to-day of parenting, it's so easy to not make anything. And that is why we created that book. I created that book during my graduate years with Michi Jigarjian, who is a powerful, super powerful woman in the art world right now. And actually, the first issue we created was with my dear friend Nona Faustine, who was a beautiful artist that we recently lost. And the last time I was in this room was during her memorial service, unfortunately. Yeah, we created that in graduate program together because we all had children under the age of 2, and we were in graduate school, and everybody seemed so much younger than us. And we were like, how the hell are we gonna do this? How are we gonna make work? And I was in many late night hours, but I just kept going. I still keep going. I, till this day, have a full-time job, not in photography, but I still keep going and still make my work because I believe in myself. I believe in the messages that I want to convey. And that book is super powerful because we said to ourselves, well, there had to have been women before us who have done this, right? And yes, there were, of course. And in that book, there are responses, very honest responses from women like Wange Chimutu. Deb Willis is in the book. It's sold out, unfortunately, but talk to me, I can get you a copy. And so it was really generous of all these amazing artists who are in the book to have come out and share their experiences about how they do both. So just all I say is, even if you don't have kids, I mean, just keep going, just keep making your work. As I'm sure Tyler will say the same thing. It's just, it won't exist without you. And it's important, as I was talking to a young gentleman earlier, it's important for our future generations. There's an indigenous thought of thinking 7 generations ahead and 7 generations in the past. We have to think about those generations as well, and to leave our archives for them. Thank you for the question. What do you guys think about the show? Anybody saw the show and have any thoughts?
I don't know. Hi, Wesley.
Hi, Wes. Yep.
Yes, hi. I did see the exhibit. I've seen it a couple of times, actually, because I feel like there's so many images that you want to take in throughout the entire exhibit. I guess my question is, for both of you guys, Kanaga was able to get that close in the images because there was like an intimacy that she had with them. Can you guys tell me a little bit about, in your own practice, how you make your subjects feel comfortable to be able to get that close to them in the images? Like, for example, Tyler, you were talking about the reference to June bug and things like that, to be able to get that close, and also to make them feel comfortable. There's a bug on my nose, So like, how are you able to do that? And then I guess partially onto that question as well is around, do you think it was easier for her in that time because taking pictures wasn't as common, so people wanted their picture to be taken, versus now I feel like a lot of people have their kind of guard up when they have pictures taken of them. So it's a little, in my opinion, kind of harder to get them to let that guard down. So I would love to hear you guys' experience on that.
Yeah, well, I think it's a really beautiful kind of inquiry because in a way I've been starting to understand intimacy as this wonderful, more of a language and a framework, and somewhat also of a fraught concept, right? Because we work in photographs. So you and the people in the audience wouldn't know the moment that came immediately before or after that June bug picture, right? So intimacy is something that is a language. I want to kind of look at it as that, as a framework. And I think Kanaga knew deeply that whether we know the details of those relationships she had with those people, what she was able to get and what it suggests is the language of intimacy, or is the framework really more of empathy than intimacy, right? Because intimacy, again, is something I see as a little fraught, right? And how close she might have been to these people, I almost leave by the wayside in my reading of them because I understand them as these moments that an artist made to say something, to have an overall project and a practice where she was socially acutely aware of what was going on in the world around her at her time, but also trying to really see the other, really, right? These people who have different experiences than her, as fully embodied human beings with rich interior worlds. And that wasn't happening for Black people at that time, right? So I see the work as powerful in that regard. And anyway, yeah.
I'm always amazed at photographers that work in fashion like you, Tyler, because for me, intimacy is connected to time, and I'm assuming that when you're shooting Beyonce, or you don't have a lot of time. As someone, I've worked in the entertainment industry before, and often you have just minutes. And I've heard a lot of photographers like Pete Sue that talk about how I've got 5 minutes to shoot Barack Obama or whoever it is. And to be able to capture what you guys capture in such a small amount of time is always fascinating and amazing to me. It's like magic. But I, on the other hand, work with children, my own children. And that is also about time as well, because children have very limited times, attention spans. So you often have to work quickly. And I don't push my kids too much either. We can spend a whole entire evening talking about shooting children and women and photographers who shoot their children. But oftentimes, like for example, there's a picture that I showed the right to wear war, because I do a lot of family work, oftentimes I can't picture people in my family, like my mother, for example. She refuses to let me photograph her. She's not comfortable in front of a camera. So in that image, and in some of the other images from that series, I've used chicken bones as a stand-in for her presence, because these are things that she's actually collected and cleaned for my children to play with, and she also has a really nice childhood memory tied to them. And so for me, that's a way of including her in the image, in the series, in the body of work that is so specific to my family. But yeah, I'm always fascinated by it. So.
I guess it's my turn. Hi.
Hi.
My question is a little bit more general based on your perspectives, which has been so great to hear. Tyler, you mentioned when you were speaking earlier about the comparison between photography and sculpting, which I found really interesting. I think you had mentioned there are a lot of similarities there in the two different mediums, and I can only assume that the first one, or maybe the one that came first to your mind, was the act of trying to capture movement in stillness. I was wondering if there's any other perspectives that you can sort of share in the similarities between the two. I just thought that was an interesting perspective.
Yeah, I think the way I look at it, which is only personally, which might not be art historically, but is that a sculptor is trying to evoke a real narrative experience via the way of an object, right? They're trying to suggest or engage the viewer to sort of circumnavigate that object they're making, and have a perspectival shift as they're walking around a sculpture to evoke an experience, right? Or to some degree. And photography through form is doing that similar thing. Really, a deep understanding of form is where a great photographer really shines, I think. And I think we can both agree on that there's that clear mastery of form in Kanaga's work, and that I would say mimics that of a sculptor who's trying to suggest narrative. That narrative comes out of the form, that it evokes, or that it evolves out of seeing a mother drawing her children in towards her, and that gesture and that shape that is created makes me think of the scene that is coming after the day that woman had, that very day with her children, or her life, really. The fact that can emerge from the way someone has constructed an image of them is, part of the beauty of photography and art, of course, but that's where I see the linkage between photography and sculpture. I'm curious for you.
Yeah, no, I honestly hadn't thought too much about the connection there. I'm always thinking about the connection between photography and painting, which is much more obvious, but when you were talking about Kanaga, that particular picture, she's a tree of life, which, Drew, I wanted to ask you, because are there two captions to that image? Is it, because I've always noted she's a tree of life to them, but is it also she's just a tree of life, or?
I think it's been, well, it was something that was assigned to her photograph.
Okay.
So it was through Family of Man that was assigned
that got
to it.
a caption.
Yeah.
Okay, yeah. No, I was thinking earlier when I was saying that about the sculptor Augusta Savage, who was popular during the Harlem Renaissance, very, very much coming up with her contemporaries there, but who never really got to fully realize her sculptures, sadly. And so, yeah, I really, that was the first time during your presentation where I kind of made that connection to her work.
And just to add, I didn't mean to cut in,
No,
but
it's good.
just to add one more thought to that great question is, I do see photography as first and foremost an object, right? And I think that we often just see it as a conveyor of information, right? That it's what's in the picture. And I'm often trying to highlight my project, and as Drew was suggesting with, unfortunately, the works that I'm making more recently with glass and mirror, which connect back to the invention of the medium of photography itself. The glass has always been a part of that. And then fabric also, that sort of deconstruct the figure, or that veil the figure, or create a suggested abstraction. That photography is first and foremost a tactile object. And that the medium and the surface that it's printed on is one and the same, and is connected deeply to the actual information within the photograph. So I see sculpture as also understanding that the form and the sort of content are inseparable.
It's interesting because the upcoming show opening in October, not that I was going to talk about it, but talk about tactile, opening in October is Seducata, a tactile lens. So, yeah. And it's interesting also, so the Kanaga show on the 4th floor is next to the Nancy Elizabeth Prophet show, which is all those busts and, wood, incredible sculptures. So maybe we'll go back now to both shows and feel the connections a little more deeply.
No, it was really great to walk through those sculptures and then arrive at Kanaga's, yeah.
Hi, my name is Destiny. Nice to meet you all. I'm originally from Mississippi and recently just had my first showing called The Love Letter to the South. I'm still new to photography, but my question for Tyler is there any other works or different type of mediums that I should add to my study as I'm embarking on photography, and also especially from being in the South?
Yeah, well, congratulations. And I mean, as many and as wide of mediums as you can. Increasingly, I'm personally into literature as informing my photography, but also cinema, as I talk about a lot. Movies being so interconnected with photography. I would try to read and watch as many movies and literature, really, whether that be theory, whether that be novels, if that's a space from which you want to create. And I think I have not seen your work, but just from the title itself, A Love Letter to the South, look at Southern American literature and look at Southern American cinema and Southern American music as spaces to hopefully inspire. The photographs, I think, there's a whole tradition and language around all of those mediums, right? And one could start with Toni Morrison and go back or go forward, and
Go to the library.
Yeah.
Don't do it online. Lost. Go to the library, sit in the friggin' art section, and go to museums, go to galleries,
and look widely and far, and look far. And look in corners you wouldn't expect yourself to look, and then at some point stop and make your work.
Thank you.
The Brooklyn Public Library is amazing.
Thank you so much to Qiana, Tyler, Pauline, and Drew for sharing so generously with us. Thank you all for joining this conversation. Good evening and take care.
Thank you.
Thank you.